They came to 74-year-old Patricia Campbell's door and screamed at her for 17 minutes straight, all because of a shelf in her garage and a wooden bird her granddaughter painted. Carol Adams and Dennis Foley, drunk on HOA power, turned petty rules into weapons, targeting the kindest woman in the neighborhood. But her daughter fought back, with evidence, a lawyer, and a flood of voices who'd had enough. And just wait until you hear the shocking twist this battle took, and how justice, in the end, finally won. I wasn't planning to share this. Honestly, I wish I didn't have to. I'm not someone who seeks attention. I don't post every part of my life online. I don't yell to be heard. But there comes a point where staying quiet feels like betrayal. Not just to my mother, but to everyone who's ever trusted a system that promised protection and delivered fear instead. That system, in this case, is called the Oak Pines Estates Homeowners Association. My mother's name is Patricia Campbell. She's 74 years old. She raised 3 of us, me and my 2 sisters, on a single salary and boxed pasta. We watched her beat breast cancer not once, but twice. She never complained, never stopped believing that kindness mattered. Even when her bones started to ache and her blood pressure needed managing, she was still the type of person who remembered the neighbor's dog's birthday. Every Halloween, she made handmade goodie bags for the kids, even if she only got 5 trick-or-treaters. After Dad passed, we tried to get her to move closer to one of us, but she didn't want to feel like a burden. "I just want someplace quiet," she said. "Something smaller, easier to manage." She found a condo in Oak Pines. It was clean, had a view of a small lake, friendly on the surface. The realtor used all the usual words: safe, tight-knit community, low-maintenance lifestyle. They never mentioned the HOA. At first, the issues were small. A letter arrived, one of those passive-aggressive form notices slipped under her door, saying she'd violated trash protocol. Her bin had stayed out past the approved collection window by 52 minutes. She was embarrassed. She called me about it, worried sick she had ruined something. I told her not to stress. It was just trash. But it didn't stop. A few weeks later, another violation arrived. This time for unauthorized lawn decor. The item in question? A tiny wooden hummingbird, painted by her 8-year-old granddaughter. The letter said it didn't conform to aesthetic standards. Still, she complied, took it down, wrote back a kind note apologizing for the misunderstanding. That was my mom, always polite, always gentle. The kind of person who bakes banana bread for the mailman. Then, in February, came the warning about the garage. Visible storage violation, the notice said. Except, there wasn't anything visible. My mother had a small metal shelf inside her closed garage. It held a toolbox, some old paint cans, a pair of gardening gloves. Nothing outside, nothing messy, nothing even remotely community disturbing. She didn't understand, so she called. No answer. She emailed. No reply. She even printed out pictures of her garage and mailed them to the HOA with a handwritten note. No response. Just silence. And then came March 3rd. It was a Monday. I know because I was in a meeting when it happened. At exactly 9:26 a.m., 3 members of the HOA board came to her door. Not 1, 3. One of them, Dennis Foley, was a retired police officer known in the neighborhood for taking things seriously. My mother, who was 5'2", barely 110 pounds soaking wet, heard the pounding and thought someone was in trouble. She opened the door without hesitation, and they descended. No greeting, no explanation, no warning, just shouting. Aggressive tones, words like non-compliance, fines, lien placement, community enforcement. They told her she was facing legal consequences, that she was undermining community standards, that repeated violations would lead to a lien against her home, that her HOA privileges, whatever that meant, would be suspended. They talked over each other. Dennis Foley leaned toward her. Another one pointed a finger inches from her face. 17 minutes. They screamed at a 74-year-old woman for 17 straight minutes. My mother, who had survived chemotherapy, who had cleaned motel bathrooms in her 20s to pay rent, who had never once raised her voice at anyone in her life, stood there shaking. She kept saying, "I'm sorry, I don't understand," and "Please, I'm doing my best." But they didn't stop. They didn't stop. Eventually, they left, just walked off, like they'd performed a duty, like they'd won something. 10 minutes later, my mother collapsed. The neighbor across the street saw her through the open door and called 911. When the paramedics got there, she was barely conscious. Her heart had seized. At 10:13 a.m., she was admitted to County General's intensive care unit. I got the call at 10:29. It was a nurse named May. She was speaking quickly, clinically, asking if I was the emergency contact. But I didn't even register what she was saying. All I heard was heart attack and your mother. I remember standing in the parking lot outside my office, trying to breathe, trying to move. And all I could think was, they did this. Not fate, not stress, not age. Them. They did this to her. Hospitals are strange places. Time bends there. Everything slows down, and yet every beep from the monitor feels like a countdown. I sat by my mother's bed and held her hand, watching the green line on the screen jump with each beat of her heart. The heart that had been pushed to its edge by people who knew exactly what they were doing and didn't care. The machines beeped steadily, but each sound cut through me like a blade. The doctor had kind eyes. He came in wearing that expression I've seen too many times on TV. Calm, practiced, professional. The kind of face you wear when you tell a family that someone almost died. He said, "Your mother's heart attack was triggered by acute stress. Her nervous system went into what we call a full fight or flight response. But she couldn't run, and she couldn't fight." That's what stuck with me. She couldn't run. She couldn't fight. It made me sick. This wasn't some inevitable medical event. It wasn't just her age. It wasn't chance. It was induced, manufactured, deliberately pushed, and all of it, was over a shelf in her garage and a wooden bird on her porch. I didn't sleep that night. I went back to her apartment while she lay in the ICU. I sat on her floral print couch, still covered with the crochet throw she made last winter, and I stared at the wall for I don't even know how long. The quiet in that space was unbearable. Then I saw the binder. She had a whole binder labeled Community Documents. My mom, ever organized, had kept every notice, every letter, every fine, every email. I opened it and started reading, and what I found wasn't just shocking. It was monstrous. Buried in legalese were clauses that would give even a dictator pause. They could fine residents for disruption to neighborhood harmony. They could penalize people for inappropriate decorative expression. They had the right to suspend your access to amenities, revoke voting rights, even initiate legal action, all based on internal board decisions. No hearings, no due process. My mother had signed all this unknowingly when she bought the unit, because that's what these HOAs do. They present these rules like they're just part of the package, like they're a small price to pay for peace and order. But what they really are is a weaponized rulebook designed to enforce uniformity, punish difference, and instill fear. And the people who run it? People like Dennis Foley, who pounded on her door and shouted at her like she was a criminal. They love that power. 2 days later, I showed up to the next HOA board meeting. It was held in the community center, in a room that looked like a church basement. Folding chairs, fluorescent lights, a fake ficus in the corner. There was a table with lemonade and cookies, like they were hosting a bake sale instead of a tribunal. The board sat at the front, behind a cheap plastic table. Carol Adams, the HOA president, was already seated, flipping through papers like she was waiting for a PTA meeting to start. Dennis Foley was there, stone-faced and unreadable, arms crossed like a sentry. I stood quietly in the back for a few minutes, trying to breathe. And then I walked up to the front, not yelling, not shaking, just calm. "Do you know what you did to my mother?" That was all I said. Carol looked up like I'd asked about parking policies. "I'm sorry, can you clarify?" I stared straight at her. "She's in the hospital. ICU, stress-induced cardiac arrest, brought on by what you did, by the screaming, the threats, the 17 minutes of intimidation on her doorstep." Dennis didn't move, didn't blink, just sat there like a statue. I held up the papers, the diagnosis, the ER report, the note from her cardiologist. She was terrified. She thought she was being attacked. Because that's what you did. You attacked her. With words, with threats, with your presence. And now she might not come home. Silence. I could feel people in the room shift in their seats. A few gasps. One elderly woman clutched her purse tighter. Then Carol leaned forward, expression unchanged. And she said, "Correlation doesn't mean causation. Just like that. A woman nearly died, and she dismissed it like I was talking about the weather." And then she smirked. Not even subtle. That little twitch of arrogance, of power, of knowing she could say anything she wanted and face no consequences. I left before I broke something. Got into my car and sat there with my hands clenched on the steering wheel so tight I thought my fingers would snap. I didn't cry at first, not out of strength, but because I was too angry to cry. The kind of anger that burns behind your eyes, the kind that eats at your throat because the words you want to scream won't come out. I wanted to ask why. Why did they need to go so far? Why did they need to humiliate her, scare her, break her, just to prove a point about a shelf in a garage? And then I realized something. They didn't care about the shelf, or the trash bins, or the hummingbird. They cared about obedience. They wanted control. They wanted to remind her that she lived under their rules. But they forgot one thing. My mother might be quiet. She might be gentle, but she raised me to know right from wrong. She raised me to stand up for those who can't. And even as she lay in that hospital bed, hooked to machines, barely able to speak, she still managed to whisper, "Don't let them scare you too, honey." So I won't. I won't let them scare me. I won't let them do this to anyone else's mother or father or child. I won't let silence be stronger than justice. I'll do what she couldn't. I'll fight. There's something strange that happens after you pass the point of grief. You become sharp, focused, like your brain clears a fog you didn't know had been there. And suddenly, you're not just mourning anymore. You're preparing to fight. The night after that HOA meeting, I sat by my mom's hospital bed and watched her sleep. There was a thin plastic mask feeding oxygen into her nose, and her fingers twitched every now and then in her sleep. Little signs that she was still in there, still trying. I whispered to her, "I'll fix this." I didn't know exactly what I meant, but I meant it. The first step was the state's HOA Oversight Board. Most people don't even know those exist. But they do, underfunded, underpublicized, buried in bureaucracy. I submitted a formal complaint with supporting documents, the medical reports, witness testimony from the neighbor across the street, the correspondence my mom had saved. When I checked the complaint history for Oak Pines Estates, I was stunned to find 2 previous complaints already on record. The first was from a Marine Corps veteran, Mike Harper, who was fined over $200 for flying the American flag on a non-approved pole. The second was from a retired schoolteacher, Susan Langley, who was sued by the HOA for putting up Halloween decorations too early. She'd hung a simple orange garland and a friendly ghost on October 1st. In both cases, the HOA had steamrolled them with legal threats and procedural delays. Neither had the time, money, or support to fight back. But I did. I started calling attorneys. Most either didn't specialize in HOA law or wanted thousands just to look at the case. But then I found Sarah Templeton. She answered her phone on the first ring. I told her everything. I didn't hold back. The stress attack, the intimidation, the silence from the board, the smirk on Carol Adams' face. There was a long pause when I finished. Then she said, "I've been waiting to go after these people for years." Turns out, she'd represented 3 families in other HOA disputes across the state. She knew Carol Adams by name. She called Dennis Foley the hall monitor from hell. And she agreed to take the case pro bono. We got to work. At first, I thought I'd just post something small, a simple thread on a homeowner's forum, something like, "Warning to anyone moving into Oak Pines Estates. Please read this before you sign anything." But the words wouldn't stop coming. I wrote everything. From the first fine about the trash bins to the moment I got the call from the ICU, from the way the board members shouted at my mother, to the blank stares in that meeting room, to Carol's smug, "Correlation doesn't mean causation." I didn't ask for sympathy. I wasn't looking for pity. I wrote it to warn, to tell people that what happened to my mother wasn't rare, that it could happen to them. I hit publish, and I went to bed. The next morning, my phone had 87 notifications. By the end of the week, the post had gone viral. People weren't just reading, they were responding. Hundreds of messages, then thousands. Some were heartbreaking. A man in Arizona whose wife suffered a fatal stroke after an HOA sent threatening letters every day for 3 weeks. A young couple fined $900 for hosting their son's birthday party with a non-approved bounce house. A woman evicted from her unit after planting sunflowers in a shared yard. Heart attacks, lawsuits, repossessions, suicides. Stories that had been buried in shame, in isolation, in silence. Now they were flooding in. I realized this wasn't about my mom anymore. It was about a system. And that system had hurt a lot of people. So I created a group. At first, it was just a private chat with 10 or 12 people. Then it became a Slack workspace. Then a Google Drive folder of documents, letters, violation photos, legal complaints. We started compiling data, trends, common tactics, the same phrases repeated in notices across different states, the same vague rules used to punish disharmony. We wrote letters to local council members, to state representatives, to senators. One of us was a journalist. He pitched the story to his editor. 2 weeks later, it was on the front page of a national outlet. HOA harassment sent my mother to the ICU. One family's story unleashes a flood of accusations. Then came the news vans, the podcast interviews. Suddenly, Carol Adams and her little army weren't hiding behind bylaws anymore. They were in the spotlight. And they hated it. A week later, I got a cease and desist letter from the HOA's lawyer. 4 pages of legal threats telling me to remove my posts, retract my claims, and stop inciting public hostility. Sarah laughed when she read it. They're scared. Good. We responded with a class action lawsuit. By that time, we had 67 families, and counting. 5 months. That's how long it took. 5 months of filings, forms, court dates, affidavits, and evidence packets. 5 months of revisiting every second of what happened, every breathless moment, every shaking sentence my mother whispered from a hospital bed. It wasn't easy. There were days I felt like I was drowning in paperwork and bureaucracy. Days when it felt like the people on the other side, Carol Adams, Dennis Foley, the whole board, had unlimited time, money, and cold indifference on their side. But we had something else. We had truth. We had voices. And we had each other. Every new message I got, every story of abuse, of intimidation, of heartbreak, pushed me forward. Every time my mother looked at me with tired but proud eyes, I knew we weren't just fighting for compensation. We were fighting to say, no more. And then, one rainy Tuesday in court, the verdict came. It was strangely quiet in the courtroom. No gasps, no applause. Just the sound of a judge reading from a sheet of paper that carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. The court finds Oak Pines Estates Homeowners Association liable for harassment, negligence, and reckless endangerment. I held my breath, but she wasn't done. Damages in the amount of $1.2 million are awarded to the plaintiffs. The board of directors is to be formally dissolved, effective immediately. The managing property company, Greenhall Residential Services, is to be terminated. And Dennis Foley is hereby permanently barred from serving in any HOA, board, or governing community role in the state of California, indefinitely. I didn't cheer. I didn't cry. I just sat there, still as stone, feeling something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Relief. Not joy, not vengeance. Just release. Like something I'd been carrying in my chest for months had finally cracked open and poured out. After the ruling, I went straight to my mother's place. She was home by then, still recovering, still moving slowly, but breathing easier. The color had returned to her face, the sparkle to her eyes. I sat down beside her and told her everything, every word of the judgment. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly in her lap. And then she cried. Not with sobs, but with silent tears that slid down her cheeks like they'd been waiting for months to fall. I just wanted to plant my flowers and be left in peace, she whispered. You will, I said. Now you will. The ruling didn't just end our fight. It sparked something much bigger. By the end of that week, 3 local news stations were at her doorstep. By the end of the month, a national outlet ran a piece titled, "They Terrorized My Mother Over a Shelf, How One Family Took Down an HOA Goliath." The story spread, and with it came a flood of responses. Victims, witnesses, lawyers, legislators. My inbox became a map of injustice, from Florida to Arizona to Oregon. Same tactics, same fear, same feeling of being powerless in the face of a group hiding behind rules. Except now people weren't just afraid. They were angry. They were ready. Lawmakers reached out. State representatives wanted help drafting HOA reform bills. We were asked to testify, to consult. Our little support group became an advocacy network. We built a website. We named it Neighbors Not Subjects. We created templates for legal defenses, hotlines for people being harassed, a platform for sharing stories publicly and anonymously. It had become a movement, and my mother's voice was at the center of it. But victory doesn't always look like headlines. Sometimes it's a quiet porch. It's the gentle sound of a spoon stirring sugar into tea. It's wind chimes tapping against one another as the sun begins to set. It's an old woman sitting outside, without fear in her chest. That's where I found the real win. One evening, a few weeks after the case ended, I was sitting with her on that porch. She was wrapped in her favorite cardigan, sipping chamomile tea, and for the first time in months, She was smiling without trying. We didn't talk about the lawsuit, or Carol, or Dennis Foley. We just sat. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she didn't flinch when a neighbor's footsteps passed by. She didn't look over her shoulder. She didn't tense. She just took another sip of tea. That's what victory really is. Not the judgment, not the money, not the headlines. Safety, dignity, peace. I think about the people who messaged me, who told me their stories. Some of them still living under HOA fear, some of them having lost too much already. And I think, this wasn't just for us. It was for every quiet voice that was ever drowned out by the sound of an angry knock. Every elderly woman who paid her dues and still felt like a prisoner in her home. Every child who couldn't decorate for Halloween. Every man who lost sleep wondering if one more warning letter meant court. It was for them, for the invisible ones, the trembling ones, the compliant ones, the kind ones. Like my mother. And if this story does anything, if it inspires anyone, let it be this. Never let rules become weapons. Never let power silence compassion. And never, ever think that you're too small to push back. Because sometimes the quietest voices leave the loudest echoes. Let me know if you'd like a full 4-part compilation into one powerful document or a script for recording or presentation. It can be formatted for performance, podcast, legal storytelling, or social advocacy.